All right, so I'm going to walk through this PowerPoint with you all so you can see some of the stuff, have your fill in the blank packet ready as we go. But just to talk about some of the stuff in our political geography unit that was not mentioned in the Rubenstein book that we want to make sure that you have access to when it comes for the AP exam. All right, so borders. We've talked about borders. We've looked at borders. We've learned about physical borders and cultural borders. And those, so water, mountain, desert, physical borders, language, religion, geometric is what Rubenstein calls our cultural borders. But we will look at some other ones that we need to know: antecedent, subsequent, relic, and superimposed are some of the other borders and boundaries that are mentioned in the AP course outline. So antecedent boundaries. Ante means before. So these are boundaries that were established before an area is populated. Big thing that you see right here, that British Columbia, Manitoba, this whole area right here, this is a line of latitude line. And so that is an antecedent boundary. Those lines of latitude were there before people got there, established in that way. So it helps with that. So antecedent or before people got there. So really lines of longitude and latitude are antecedent boundaries. Also look at like physical boundaries. Those are also can be counted as antecedent boundaries. Subsequent, sub means below or after. So these are boundaries that come after an area was settled. And it does sometimes it takes into account considerations of social and cultural factors. So linguistic borders, religious borders, those are things that would be subsequent. It's created after people have been there. So this boundary right here between Pakistan and India, when India was partitioned and divided after it became independent from Great Britain, this was built, and this was established along the lines of religion. So Pakistan is primarily Muslim, and India is primarily Hindu, and so the boundary was between where the Muslims and the Hindus would mix and interconnect. Okay, a relic boundary, a boundary that was very firm and strong in there, but it no longer exists, but it can still be seen maybe socially or culturally in there. And so you have this in East and West Germany. East and West Germany, this would be an example of a relic boundary. East Germany was communist, West Germany was democratic. And so you have this, the Berlin Wall used to be there. You just have this connection between the two. It's not there anymore. The wall, the border is not there. You can freely go between East and West Berlin. There's no distinction between the two. However, you can still see architecturally and developmentally some of the differences between East Germany and its communist section and West Berlin, and that would be part of West Germany, which would be its democratic principles. Superimposed. Superimposed is a boundary that ignores cultural patterns. So when you look at the modern Africa map, it was not established by people living in Africa. It was really the borders and shapes of states was really designed by the Europeans looking to control aspects of Africa, because at that time it was seen as the more land your country had, the stronger you were. And so at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, European countries met in an attempt to try to carve up Africa so that it would best fit them and give them the most resources. And so these countries kind of went through the scramble of Africa where they would and try to take as much land as they could with the much resources as they could that would benefit their country. Not a single African country was a part of the conference, and so it did not take into account any of those cultural considerations of ethnicity or language or religion, a history of conflict or violence between people groups. And so because of that, when the countries became independent, it led to some conflict and struggle like we talked about with Ethiopia and Eritrea, where we talked about in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis, tracing that back to its colonial legacy there. So a lot of conflict and struggle happened there, but these countries came together and did not take into account any of those. So that's what makes it superimposed. It's from outside, put into effect, and not looking at the cultural patterns there. Now, something else, a buffer state is a country that is in between two warring countries. So like Poland would be a buffer state between Germany and Russia. Mongolia was a buffer state between the Soviet Union and China in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s in there. So these, Mongolia, Poland, those were between two countries that were that are at conflict with each other. And so it's that buffer, that in between to kind of keep the peace and keep everything kind of calm and whatnot. But you have that buffer in between those two warring or rival states, stuff like that. But its big thing is to curb hostility. During the Cold War, Canada was between the continental U.S., which is where almost all the people live, and the Soviet Union. Continuing on this process of the Cold War, the domino theory is a belief or a theory that led the United States government and its impact in foreign policy from the 50s to the 80s. And so its thought was like a domino. If you push the domino down, all the other dominoes would collapse after that. That if one country in a region came under the influence of a communist government, that the surrounding countries would also come into influence of that communist government. So that domino effect, that if one fell, all the other countries around it would fall as well. And so this led to our involvement in the Korean War and our involvement in the Vietnam War for the fear of the Soviet Union gaining control of regions of the world, and then communism spreading from country to country. The East-West divide, we talk about this, the West and the East, and so you look at, it's kind of like the United States and its allies would be in the West, and the Soviet Union, China, other communist countries, and their allies were part of the East. So you had the East, which was communist, you had the West, which was democratic, and this really fueled a lot post-World War II up until the 1990s of a lot of how the world's politics were done and who was on what side and what groups were together and who supported whom and all of that. So you had this kind of build up, these blocks, the NATO and the Warsaw Pact working against forces that were opposing each other, and of this balance of power set up to create this world that we had. And so you had your major states of the United States and the Soviet Union, and there are countries that were their allies supporting them. But this is the East-West divide when it came to communism on the East and democratic governments on the West. North-South divide, we kind of look at this, and the countries to the north of this are seen as our developed countries or our more economically developed countries, and the countries to the south would be our less economically developed countries. And so this line is getting kind of fuzzier and fuzzier as we move on. But this is kind of an this is an old school geopolitical, geoeconomic divide of the country, saying the North and the South are the more developed and the less economically developed countries. But you could use this line, Brandt line, it's also known as, to kind of divide the world into two groups. And they used to say like the haves and the have-nots, although it's not that same anymore, but you do see in there. And some of the countries below, so you have Singapore, you have Australia, New Zealand, are part of the North, even though they are not in the North. It's so that developed North, and you see in the less developed South as we go. Law of the sea. This is a really big one that's important to note for a couple of things. So the first one, it was made by the United Nations. You control up to 12 nautical miles off. So that is your country. That is part of your country up to 12 nautical miles. You have those rights, the law, everything that goes on there. And if they come within, and anybody comes within that, then it's like they're declaring war on your country. You have the rights to up to 200 nautical miles off the coast of your country. So you have the rights to anything in there, the fishing, anything that is found, the passageways, all of that. You have up to 200 nautical miles. Those are your exclusive economic rights. You'd have the median line principle. The median line principle means if there's not 200 miles between two countries, then you cut it in half. So if there's only 80 miles between two countries, then it's 40 and 40 in there. But you have that 200 nautical miles off the coast for the exclusive economic rights. This is interesting because now China has really gone in and they're actually building islands in the places in the South China Sea and other areas. They're building islands, or they're trying to take control of small unpopulated islands, and saying that they're part of China to give them those greater exclusive economic rights, to give them a greater push and influence when it comes to the sea and strategic shipments and placements of items as they go. So, they're really trying to use this law of the sea to benefit them and strengthen their economy. And the last one is enclaves and exclaves. So an enclave is a country that is completely surrounded by another area. It's by land. So you have C would be an enclave because A completely surrounds C. It has nothing no water, nothing. It's completely surrounded by by A. So like Lesotho is an example of this. It's completely surrounded by South Africa. The Vatican City would be an example of this, completely surrounded by Italy. It's in there. So that's why that's an enclave. An exclave is part of a country that is separated from another part of that country by land. So C is part of country B. So you have country B is here, and then you have land that is not part of country B, and then C would be the exclave separated. It's not physically contiguous, it does not touch B, but it is part of country B. So it would be like Alaska. Alaska is part of the United States, but it is separated from the United States by Canada. It is separated by land. It goes United States, Canada, Alaska, which is part of the United States. So that is an example of an exclave because it is separated by the country by land. It can only be by land. If it's not by water, it's only by land.